Reflecting on his career in 2014, he told the New York Times, "I did the best I could with what I had." For generations of readers, what he had was literary magic.
But for more, let's cross to New York City. Max Rudin of the nonprofit publishers Library of America. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
My pleasure.
Max, let me just begin by showing you here. This is the front page of daily newspaper Le Monde, a broadsheet of record in this country. And there is Philip Roth in this evening's edition, splashed across the front page. What's been the reaction where you are?
Sadness, a sense of diminishment in American letters. I mean, Roth was a giant, towering figure, one of a group of writers whose careers started in the 50s and 60s that included John Updike and Saul Bellow, who really bestrode the literary landscape and was the last of that generation to survive and to continue writing and to continue reinventing himself up until his very recent retirement. And so really very much a sense that of things of shrinking a little bit. And I would say, in our office where we had the rare privilege of working with him, closely on the Library of America edition of his work, a real personal sadness. I mean, it was a great privilege to work with him, and also it was a huge amount of fun. I mean, he was one of the, not only one of the most intelligent, but one of the funniest human beings you can imagine. So it's just sad to think of the office without his presence.
Really fun because some of the French journalists who we've been listening to this Wednesday describing a guy who could be a little bit intimidating if he felt you weren't on your game.
Well, he was extremely, I mean, in a way, it's funny to be interviewed about Philip's work because he was the most cogent and intelligent interpreter of his own work. So that's a little intimidating. But, I would say he was extremely intelligent. He was a perfectionist. I mean, when we worked with him, you could not send him proofs or galleys without having them come back, completely, corrected and rewritten. He would get involved with things like, jacket copy and even the jacket, photo. He was someone who cared very deeply about his legacy in American letters, and that's why the Library of America edition was important to him. And he was determined to get it right. So he was a perfectionist. Maybe that was intimidating. But I would say that, he was an extremely warm and loyal person as a friend, and he was funny. I mean, the first time he came to our offices, I remember we were probably working on the second volume, and he walked out of the elevator, and one of our editors saw him there in the hallway and said to him, gamely, don't I recognize you from one of our book jackets? And Philip looked at him and said, "Yes, I'm Louisa May Alcott."
It's funny you should say that because
I don't know if that joke works in French, but
works in English. And also, of course, he's got characters called Philip Roth in some of his novels.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, on the one hand, you can say, what material does a novelist have to work with? I mean, he has his own experience. And Philip was a ruthlessly honest writer, and he used the experience that he knew. And the experience that he knew was his own experience as a novelist and as a man. I mean, I would say, though, that to think of that as narrowing in some way, I think, is to misunderstand, his career. I mean, he mined his experience for an extraordinary diversity of themes, of modes, I mean, it's hard to imagine it's the same writer, who mastered, the comic irony of Goodbye Columbus, the outrageous, kind of stand-up comedy farce of Portnoy's Complaint, the tempered realism of the American trilogy, and then the chastened elegiac mode of the late books. I mean, they were all him. They all came out of his experience, and I think the other thing to say about him is that what those 31 books and 51 years make together, is one of the most extraordinary literary journeys in American literature.
Yeah, and I was just going to say on that point, Max Rudin, Portnoy's Complaint comes out in 1969. He graphically describes in it the sexual frustration of people of his generation coming of age. There is that aspect of it, and as you mentioned, the later novels, which are the ones people here in France remember, in particular, you know, they draw parallels between books like The Plot Against America, which wonders what would have happened if Roosevelt had lost the election and it had been a far-right candidate who had won. Which Roth is going to matter more in the long run?
Well, you know, I don't think you can separate them, and I think this is why Roth is one of the great ironists in American literature, and I think why he felt such sympathy with Eastern European writers and their sense that, you know, he was a great champion of Bruno Schulz and Ivan Klima and those writers and helped to introduce them. I think he felt a consanguinity with their deep sense of irony. I mean, look, Roth is on the one hand a vitalist. You know, he's on the side of libido, and he's on the side of imagination and of reinvention. I mean, look, it's the only other career you can look at in American letters which involves a writer reinventing himself so many times and finding his way forward imaginatively is Henry James. And that's why those are the two writers who occupied the most volumes in the Library of America, Roth 10 to James's 16 or so. So he's on the side of vitality, but he's also on the side of, you know, the forces in the world, not on the side of, he's also acknowledges and is one of our great writers of the forces that those, you know, that vitality bumps up against. You know, the forces of history, you know, the forces of anti-Semitism, of prejudice, of violence. I mean, and this is what makes, you know, the American trilogy books so interesting. I mean, all three heroes in those books have a kind of upward trajectory at the beginning, you know, just like, you know, the great upward trajectory of American, you know, immigrants after the war, a great hopeful trajectory that you could be, you know, out of an immigrant culture or from a poor part of town and yet be fully American at the same time. And all three of those heroes run into some form of irrational opposition that brings them down. And I think that, I mean, that sense of, you know, the concept, you know, he also, I mean, this also happens in Roth's books about artists, where, you know, the subject is really the unforeseen consequences of one's art. That's what the Zuckerman books are about. So Roth is, you know, is both very sharp on the forces of reinvention and self-invention, and also the forces which block self-invention. As I say, I think that's what makes him great, and that's what makes the books various, and that's what makes him, as I say, one of the great ironists in our literature.
All right, and certainly a sizable work that's definitely worth reading from start to finish. Max Rudin of Library of America Publishers. Many thanks for speaking with us from New York City.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me.
Stay with us.